I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of art to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for a work that interests us some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/pensound. PoemTalk has once again gone on the road. I, along with my colleagues Zach Cardner, Chris Martin, and Anna Strong-Safford, and we are happily here today in Los Angeles, California, in Pacific Palisades, to be exact, at the lovely home of Marjorie Perloff, joined by Danny Snelson, who teaches here at UCLA, whose books include Inventory Arousal, 2011, Epic Lyric Poem, 2015, Execute Text, EXETXT, all caps, a Gauss PDF, highly recommended, by the way, 2015, and Radios, published by Make Now Press in 2016, whose current critical historical theoretical book is about the Little Database, setting big data analysis against and in homage to the Little magazine, and who, I hear it being whispered, is now making graphic novels or comics.
Oh.
And also by Nancy Perloff, art historian, musicologist, curator of modern and contemporary collections at the Getty Research Institute here in Los Angeles, whose book, Explodity, Sound, Image, and Word in Russian Formalist Book Art, is based on the amazing collection of Russian modernism at the Getty, among whose many curated exhibits are Concrete Poetry, Words and Sound in Graphic Space 2017, and World War I, War of Images, Images of War 2014, and whose recent publications include Books to Look At, Books to Listen to, The Great Russian Avant-Garde Experiment. And by the aforementioned Marjorie Perloff, our host for today's Poem Talk, whose many important critical and scholarly books include The Dance of the Intellect, Wittgenstein's Ladder, The Futurist Moment, to name just a few, and whose recent book is Edge of Irony, Modernism in the Shadow of the Habsburg Empire, and among whose poetry-related essays in recent years are, just to take a random sampling, an article on Susan Howe's Late Style, a course of lectures at the T.S. Eliot Summer School, which I think is being published. That was summer 2017. The talks were given. An essay on Beckett's poetry for a collection titled The New Beckett. So much more, as usual. And for us, in a forthcoming book, a brilliant 1,000-word essay on a single poem by Frank O'Hara. Marjorie, thank you for coming. No, you didn't come. We came.
Yeah.
Thank you for hosting us here at your house.
Thank you for coming, Al.
Yeah.
And thank you for the whole team.
Yeah. And Danny?
Delighted to be here. Thank you both.
UCLA, you're not far.
I'm just down the street.
Yeah.
Literally, just down the street.
It's great to see you. And Nancy, thank you so much.
A long way down the street.
Thank you so much. I'm
This
so
is something
delighted.
of a homecoming for you.
It's great to be part of this.
Yeah. Well, today we four are gathered here at Marjorie's home to talk about a piece by John Cage called Writing for the Second Time Through Finnegans Wake. A video recording of Cage performing this piece was made in 1978. It's been on Vimeo for about 8 years and has so far only received 2,700 views. So among our hopes for this conversation is that more people will want to watch Cage in action, really in action on that occasion. Before the reading, Cage read a preface explaining the structure of his own work in relationship to the lexical and linguistic experiments in Joyce's Finnegans Wake. The text of the preface and the aleatory poem itself are available in Cage's book, Empty Words, starting on page 133. And today we're going to focus on the first few pages of the piece. In the recording, Cage starts reading the messatic itself at around 16 minutes and 50 seconds in, and we will listen through to the 22nd minute mark. So here now is John Cage in 1978 performing Writing for the Second Time Through Finnegans Wake.
Ross with 2-1 Nathan Joe, a malt gem shen shoot solid man, that the Humpty Hillhead of himself is at the knockout in the park. Jick up the Father, most heaven sky sign, Judges our Deuteronomy, watch future pension juki chap, mighty cement and edifices, the jebel and the crop herb a fly day, and she all casually answers helpers, jolly bool and struppet hump, and all the uproar aufroofs, to fjell his baywinds obobos, all the livy-long tricky trokies. Was he on the joint? Was he famous old as you? Jamie, our country is a French, Sorcerer. This is the Grand Mont's engine. This is the Alps hooping to shelter shock the three Lepoliums. This is their Leghorns. Ginny's is a coup in her Philippi dispatch to irrigate the Willingdon. The Ginny's Fontenoy bowed Belgium bonnet to Busby. This is the Hindu waxing rangy mad for the Hindu seaboy. Cry to the Willingdon. Gist appeared to nigh Militopicos and to morn. We wish for a muddy musical chocolate box. I say incubus. Used we Mammon Lucius Grand Historiarum wrote near bluest Jerry building. To the year and laughters, confusion hold them. This Carl on the copy, Parth alone, forshapen his pig-made, wag's head, shrunk his plod's foot. 'Tis a jute. Swap hats, an excheck, a few strong verbs, yap yazard a bast mutt. Has-at, hesitancy, I trumple from wrath in mine minds. Jute, one eye gone black, cross your qualm, have sylvan objects, alves, beats, old Waldy Cargan of prohibitive pomifructs. Dublin's giant may mud sunder who oped it closer. And Jarl Van Hoother laying cold hands on himself, and his two little Jiminies, cousins of Castle Bedermot, come to the keep of a rosy Jiminy with soft years walk to touch him his tickles. You were the double-jointed janitor the morning they were delivered, and you'll be a grandfer when the right hand seizes what the love arm knows. Hetty Jane's a child. She'll be coming, their torch to rekindle the flame. She'll do no juggly-wuggly with her war souvenir Muriel. Assure there. Jubilee scatterguns, family symbolizing puritas per usuals. Jappy-jap among Sibylline Mullicky Kingable Khan. Practical joke piece. Suchelty co-comediant, his house about him with invariable broad-stretched Juke and Kallikek families, at one time annoying, see Irwicker. Jesse's ripe occasion, Arcadum Villa Pleach, Vala Pluck, Fick up for Flesh Nelly, Guinness Thaw Tool in Jumi Dinner, Oozlefin, a nice how do you do in pool black time. Jurgenson's shrapnel, communionism, Usu capture, the same tongue and commutative justice that there is not one tittle of hypertituitary man-like cavern ethics, blue ruin and creeping Jenny, Eglantine's choicest herbage, man's swell that aims swell, many jiffies, furbishing pot lids, door brasses, scholars, apple cheeks, and link boys' medals, cross Eblin's chilled hamlet, subjects of King St. Salmon alive with their priggish mouths all open, a house of call at Cooge's place, old Sot's hole, by setting a match to Stewart's potatre, joined had been the variety, had stimulants in the shape of G and G's, juiced after taking their liquor from highway and brown byway, Scotia Picta, and he who denies it, may his hairs be rubbed. His Majesty, that one-crooned king among rhapsods piped decent so art. Jail, chorus, jail of Mountjoy. Jail him and joy. He was sick 7 dry Sundays a week. Jolting the backtrap omnibus caught his death of Fusiliers.
So Nancy, we are going to define what a messastic is. We are going to explain how this thing was put together. But I thought it would be fun to start by asking you and Marjorie to tell. I understand that you prepped this by together listening. Well, and I know that, and Marjorie told me how much pleasure there was in this, listening to this again. Nancy, and I assume you agree. What was your response to listening again? What did it sound like to you?
Okay, it's really quite remarkable because I find, although there are particular lines that I remember and I feel I'm returning to, much of it
Remember
almost
from Joyce?
No,
Or remember
not
from
Joyce.
the cage?
Remember from the cage,
Right.
yeah, not from the Joyce. There are other sections that are almost, it's almost as if I'm hearing them for the first time. And that's a very interesting kind of balance that I find between familiarity, lines that somehow stay in my mind, and other lines that continue to be difficult, that continue not to be memorable in the same way. But the other point I would just want to make that continues to interest me and that is very much about sound as well as the visual is the contrast between the way the text looks and the way it sounds.
And what would that contrast be? You're so right.
Yeah, for example, the first line, let's just take the first line, Roth with 2-1, Nathan Joe. If you just look at it and you don't say it out loud, 2-1, yes, that makes sense, it would, but one might have said twone. One doesn't know. It could have been that. There are many words that are not real words in this text. Nathan Joe, somehow that D gets elided or doesn't get heard, but it is present when you look at it. So that's just one example. Another, just a few lines down, that I always await cage because I'm not sure how to say it, is the PFTJSCHUT, which he says very quickly. And this idea of having multiple consonants in a row that are not quite pronounceable, but that he does pronounce as if they kind of come off the tongue. That's a very interesting balance or contrast for me.
Marjorie, in general, what's the pleasure?
Well, it's also, I just want to follow up on that a minute. It's also that, let's say the Y, when a Y is in final position like day, D-A-Y, you don't hear a Y. And so when you see the Y, it's one thing. Same thing with the letter E, but half the time E's are not even pronounced. You know, it could be back there. So in fact, the visual deconstructs the audio and vice versa. You have to both hear it and see it. Now, the main charge against this, I once gave a talk on this. This is years ago, and it was on Roratorio, which is then the musical version of this, which is more complex, but it's the same text, basically the same text. And members of the audience, the big complaint you'll always get, we might as well begin by anticipating it, is, well, as a Joyce's words, what did Cage do? He just took Joyce's words. Joyce is the great artist. He coined all these words. He did it, and Cage just sort of chopped it up, and so what? That's not really art, you know, that old argument. But the fact is, he does a lot of things that Joyce doesn't do. It's true that he takes this from Joyce, and I just want to show you an experiment I made. We might start with that. The messastic text, a messastic means an acrostic that goes down the middle, not on the left margin.
Right.
But it means that the letter, a 50%, this is a 50% messastic, which means between the J and the A of James Joyce, you can't have an A. Between the A and the M, you can't have an M. 100% messastic would be you can't have a J or an A between the J and the A. You can't have an A or an E, or an M between the A and the M, which would be even harder to do. But so you have the messastic case, but then Cage says somewhere, and that's the key to the whole thing, the wing words, that is the words to the side of the messastic, are done according to taste. Well, what does that mean, according to taste? There he doesn't follow the rules because, now watch what I did. If we take that first one again, Roth with 2-1, Nathan Joe, A Malt Gem Shen, Chute, solid man, that the Humpty Hill head of himself is at the knockout in the park. I observed the rules completely and came up with this, and you'll see how I lose the rhythm. Nathan Joe, Rodapec, Malt, Gem, or Shen. Notice the chute, solid man, Humpty Hill head, upturned point in places at the knockout in the park. In other words, I took all the things from Joyce, I observed the rules, but I changed the wing words to make them longer or shorter, and that's when you can see that he has picked them each time so carefully. Now Nancy can talk about, or Danny can talk about the rhythm better than I can, to create a certain rhythm.
He made a poem.
He didn't need to include Roth with 2-1. He could have just said Nath and Joe.
Right.
You see?
Right.
That might be a good place for me to jump in and start, because I love that I really think this is a very creative work for John Cage, and it's all about the selection of the wing words, where he's not just following a set of rules to their logical conclusion, but rather he's making intensive choices with each and every selection, right, about those wing words, which I was wondering about this first one. We start Roth with 2-1 Nathan Joe. It's so Roth sounds kind of like writing, maybe, like it's sort of written, but 2-1 is two people at once. You could say it's like Cage and James Joyce, and Nathan Joe is the combination of two names.
Doing a lot of work in that first line.
There's a lot of stuff, and it's really
Shay.
about choosing the Roth with 2-1 Nathan Joe. And that carries throughout the entire poem. When I'm reading it, I'm looking to see, why did he choose this and not that?
Danny,
How did he
pick
make those
another
choices?
line where the wing words are creative.
Oh, sure.
If you want.
There's many of them.
Oh, they're all throughout. Well, this is the main thing, and I think it comes out in the way that he reads it, that there's a lot of connectors, right? So instead of just reading it directly word, more similar to, say, what he does with empty words when reading Thoreau's journals, here you get this really enunciatory, very impassioned reading. It's as though he's really making sense of the text for you and writing a new story, a new poetic text within the original. So I think anything from the very end of our passage, I think, was one of the best things that he did here. There's not very many J's in the text, and we'll talk more about that.
No, there's that page 142.
At the
bottom.
Page 142, he says jail, but the way he reads it, jail, chorus,
And
jail of mountain joy, jail him and joy he was. And you can see he's reveling in this chorus of J's, because he's just hunting for J's all day long. So, but the way he reads it, it's as though it's a dramatic monologue in Shakespeare.
And just to add, I hope, to what Danny's saying, and what I tried to do a little bit just musically, is I tried to go through and kind of think about tempo. And think about dynamics, those two things, because he is a composer. And there's a few passages just to call to your attention. One is on page 140, where we have the jiminies, and the jiminies get mentioned twice. And he gets to end his two little jiminies, cousins of Castle, and he starts moving very quickly. And that continues with the next Jiminy. Jiminy with soft year's walk to touch him his tickles, if I said that right. So you have this speeding up, and at the very top of that page, another phenomenon which I love, which is that you have words that only sound like a real word when you hear him pronounce them, like Dublins, which of course is Dublin. But when you just see it, Dublins, it has a different meaning visually. The only other point I then wanted to make about tempo and speeding up and so forth is on page 142, where he really gets quiet. And it's really as if the instruction, piano, like soft, in a piece of music, happens. So the many jiffies, furbishing pot lids, door brasses, scholars' apple cheeks, and link boys' medals, it gets quieter and quieter. And then suddenly at a house of call, if you listen to that again, you'll hear forte. It's as if he marked it almost. This is going to be distinguished. And then our challenge as critics is why? Why is that passage piano and the next one forte? What is significantly being expressed via dynamics?
Why is it so important that Cage explain his process, his thinking, his conversations with colleagues? It's important. The intro, the preface he read at this occasion is printed in empty words. I think pretty exactly. There might be a couple of changes. Marjorie, why does he do this a lot?
It's faux important, just like the Duchamp. because he doesn't really tell you what he's doing. He tells you the messatic method. We can all figure that out, and then he tells you that the original one had this many pages, and then he wrote through it again, and he gave himself another rule, which is never to use the same syllable twice, which is pretty hard to do, actually.
Very hard, yeah.
And he'd put them on index cards and all that. But what he doesn't tell you that you have to figure out yourself is just the things we've been saying. Look, most E's are silent E's. The one Nancy just looked at, joined, had been variety, had stimulants at the shape. You don't hear that E. You don't hear the E in shape at all. So when you hear them, mainly you hear it as a symphony of J's, J, 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 because you have James Joyce. You have two J's.
A lot of J's.
And J is not a very common letter, so he often has to go a long way to find J, which he wouldn't for the others.
A long way in the original
One
text.
thing Nancy and I were talking about is, could you do this same thing if your name were Gregor Wroblewski? Or any long name. In other words, it's very convenient for Cage that James Joyce is a short name and you can handle it that way. You couldn't do this with just any name. And again, if you just read the introduction, you would think, well, he liked Finnegans Wake so much, so he did it, but he never really had read the Wake. But his introductions are useful, but they're always parodies in a way, and you have to then fill them in because the introduction doesn't tell you very much.
But don't you think when he says, I became devoted to non-syntactical, demilitarized
true.
language?
Yeah.
It's a very important moment, which I want to
Yeah.
get back to. But first, I want to ask Danny. Sorry, I'm going to ask you a question. What is the relationship between Cage's work and Joyce's work? What is the relationship being set up? I don't mean in a textual, procedural sense. I mean, there is implicitly a thing that's being said about Finnegans Wake. What is it?
About-
If there is. Cage is saying something about
he's
Finnegans
saying
Wake.
so many things
Yeah, I
about
know. I
Finnegans
want
Wake.
you to start.
I want to answer that by building out to the sense that the rules he sets up in the introduction, they don't tell you what the poem produces, but they give you enough that you can follow
That's right.
the variances where he's making decisions. And there is, I think, the most interesting thing, because what he's saying about James Joyce
Yes.
is that he likes to read it. Or that he wants to read it. In the introduction, he talks about never
How
having
he
time
owned the book and
to read
didn't read
Finnegans
it.
Wake, and he said, I'm never going to read this. I'm too busy making music. And so what
Did he
did,
read it when he did this work?
I think he did. I think he read
It's a
it.
kind of reading.
I think he read it mostly for
mining
J's
it.
because there's so few J's. I think he read it for J's. He read it, and I think that creative form of reading, the idea that you can approach a text with some askew notion of how that reading might proceed and then produce a work out of it. I think it was it was clearly something he loved to do. It was a meaningful reading experience. And I think it offers us a method for thinking, well, maybe this is one way that I could read James Joyce. Like, why not read Finnegans Wake doing this myself, as you did,
But
Marjorie?
it's the antithesis of the scholars reading
Absolutely.
it, figuring out who are the twins, what's the biblical cycle, what's the Vico cycle,
Which is
etc.
why the preface, I agree with you, is a faux explanation.
But it's so much more fun.
basically
It's like he's
saying-
knitting.
He
It's
said
like
you can
knitting
hold it
at
upside
reading.
down, then
Yeah.
you see the J's better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to reduce further what you're saying into a sort of a simple sophomoric statement, which is we all own books that we know we should be reading, that we love, even though we haven't read them a certain way. So you could either just not read it, never even approach it in a close reading, sort of page by page or scholarly way, or you can do whatever it is that makes it work for you.
Listen, in his introduction, he talks so much about he's got all this business correspondence, his editor's hassling him, he's tired. This is just like, it's like a relaxing way to read the book without working too hard.
It's
It's
almost a little
wonderful.
performance
It's
of being
fun.
annoyed.
Yeah.
I'm too busy. I say no, and he comes after me. This Anderson guy comes after me, and finally I decide to do it. But then it's too long, and I need to come up with it. I mean, it's just
this
a
is what he-
wonderful
he
story about a
turns-
But he's
grumpy.
also saying it's unreadable in a way, don't you think?
He's absolutely
I mean, have you
unreadable
ever
in
read
a
it? Who here
traditional
has read all of
sense.
Finnegans Wake?
Oh, it's
have not.
impossible. There's a reading group that's going on at my university, and they've gotten, I think, 20 pages in a year. Right? So that it's that like laborious, so it's at the anti-laborious reading. And
Yeah,
my favorite line is,
exactly.
it turns irritation into pleasure.
And yet, when Nancy started off this conversation and read the first line, she did a close reading of the first line. and it's totally, or you did. One of you
he's
did.
aware.
It's
But there's
totally
something
brilliant. I mean, he
else-
does everything that you need to
Yeah.
do in that first line.
Yeah.
But there's something else that Marjorie and I were talking about that maybe others are alluding to as well. And this is part, there are various questions. First of all, what does it mean to read?
Yes.
How is reading different from speaking? And he makes you aware of that the whole way through. The other thing, which Marjorie brought up last night particularly, that's important, is you're not meant to hear all of it. Things intervene. Just the way, as Cage may be described, you're on a street corner and you're looking at a store and a car drives by, so you can't see the store. Similarly here, as hard as you try to hear and listen to every sound, they're going to pass you by. There are going to be some that always pass you by. And I think that's an experience that he's trying to recreate.
But I would say Joyce
important.
was perfect because here's the interesting thing. He also wrote through the cantos. You know, he tried to write through Pound's cantos, and it didn't work.
Yeah, people don't
and
like
he
it.
decided it didn't work. He tried it once. I think he tried it twice. It didn't work. Now, why didn't it work? Because the cantos are already deconstructed in a sense. In other words, the cantos don't have syntax. They don't have complete sentences, which is what he didn't like in Joyce. And the cantos already are nothing but fragments. Palace in a smoky light, anaxiforming is avunculea, you know. So Pound already did it in a way. So there's no point doing it to somebody like Pound. You can't do it. And Joyce is perfect. It's not that every writer would be perfect.
We have to go further with this point because this is a really important point. He takes Finnegans Wake almost because it's a conventional text, because he can do his
Well, it
thing
has such
to it.
wonderful sounds. It's not
And it's
quite
hilarious and so funny. You know, you're not going to get
Jucky
you're not going to
Wucky.
get Jolly Brule and Jiminy and
Jucky
Pounds in
Wucky
the
and
same way.
Conventional in the
Jucky
sense
Wucky,
that it's
you know.
got its syntax
It has such
intact,
wonderful language.
intact. So he can summon Norman O'Brien and Thoreau, who are both saying that we need to demilitarize the language by seeing syntax as the
Yeah.
arrangement of the army, or a sentence
always
as the
says
feet
that,
marching. He says it often, but it's
About
really
Thoreau.
important here because he's saying basically, I chose Joyce. Most of you think that Joyce would be one of those impossible sources, but in fact, it's exactly perfect for what I want to do with this work, because I want to challenge that idea of syntax as the arrangement of the army. So is there, I mean, critique is the wrong word, Danny, but I asked you before what the relationship of the Cage text is to the Joyce text.
Yeah, I think it's a reading, and I think a reading in the scholarly sense.
A
So it's
reading, meaning
published,
an interpretation.
Yes, it's published both in Triquarterly, an academic publication, and its original publication was through the James Joyce Quarterly as a supplement to Volume 15. And this is the heyday of structuralism. So you have issues of structuralist theory reading James Joyce alongside this crazy experiment as scholarship. And so one of the things I think Cage is a proto-digital humanist. I think it's creative scholarship, and I think that really it's a reading of Finnegans Wake that is a singular, rich reading that we all can sit here and linger with, but an interpretive text that condenses, like any other reading, right? Condenses, compresses, produces an argument. I think all of that is at play here.
Another thing that's interesting, actually, and I was just thinking as Danny was speaking, is after all, a reading is a performance. And one question related to that is, could anyone else perform this work? Or is it only Cage who can do it? And the other is,
Is there a factual answer to that? Have people perform this?
Well, I bet they are now. They certainly
Yeah.
will begin to. We
Yeah.
can't rely. Look, Cage had the most conflicted view of recordings. He didn't like recordings. He hated the idea of recordings, and he didn't like most of the recordings of his work. So now we only have this via recording, his voice, since he's dead. And sooner or later, people will start, as you did, lecture on nothing. Certainly, I think other people can read it. And it wouldn't change the relation of the audio to the visual in that way. No, they could. I mean, it wouldn't be as beautiful as his voice in a certain way, or the tempo might be a little different, but certainly one can. One can look at it as a score, and it became the score for the oratorio.
Right.
But an interesting thing is Cage then criticized that. I want to mention that he said the problem with using things like James Joyce is it creates stanzas. That's still conventional. So you see how they're like stanzas? Every James Joyce, and then you have space. They're like stanzas. So he said he didn't like that. And that's what you get when you use somebody's name. So when he got to later works like What You Say, which takes off from Jasper Johns, all he does is take a statement by Jasper Johns, a prose statement that doesn't look as if you could do anything with it. It's just a prose statement. And he then writes through that using certain key words, not Jasper Johns, but the word could be tendency. There's one about you have a tendency. What is a tendency? And then that word T-E-N goes down and forms the mesostic. And those are then much more, even more dissociated in a way, sort of later works. And that's what he was doing closer to his death, was not doing these anymore because he thought they were too fixed, too formal, almost.
Nancy, you were saying something and then we riffed after that. Do you want to finish your thought?
Well, I think the other thought was just my curiosity in hearing Cage perform / read this multiple times. What did he say? Obviously for Roratorio, he used a recording of himself reading it because Roratorio was part of a much more complicated work with music and film. But I'm interested, because he is, after all, a composer and a performer, in how the readings changed over time. It's not anything I can answer for you. It's just a question, because this is a performance. It's very much a performance. We see him and we hear it that way.
Yeah.
And I think those performative dimensions are really interesting.
Yeah.
So the recording they were listening to was at Franklin Furnace in 1978. But in the same year, he performed the same text at the Nova Convention, William Burroughs' Nova Convention in London, alongside
is that
Allen
very
Ginsberg, alongside Timothy Leary and rock bands. And so I don't have a recording of that, but you can
Are you
imagine...
saying he performed this work or part of it?
This work, yes. The writing through Finnegans Wake for the second time, writing for the second time through Finnegans Wake was also performed at the Nova Convention.
I didn't know that.
And the context would be very different.
The context would be very different. I imagine his delivery would be very different. I'm thinking of his performance where there is a recording of Empty Words in Milan, where the crowd is raucous and taking over the stage. Here, the audience is just sort of quietly listening.
They're
and
pretty
it's an
passive,
intimate
they're
space.
receptive. Nobody
They're
walked out
receptive.
in a huff, which
Nobody
happens
walked out in a huff.
sometimes with Cage.
Right.
And they laughed at the Norman O'Brien stuff, which is always kind of a funny, funny line,
Right.
when he said, "I became devoted to non-syntactical, demilitarized language." Laugh. That's an assenting laugh, right?
Yeah, everybody laughs
Yeah.
hard, yeah.
Yeah.
It's
So,
interesting.
well, what do you take? It was, I think, it seemed like an academic audience.
Yeah, I think so. It seemed like an academic audience who was very aware of his, very familiar with the work that was following along. One of the things that I found most interesting, though, to follow on this notion of performance is the relationship of the printed version that we're all looking at to being one of those people listening. And so I listened to this a number of different times. I listened to it once with the text, without the text. I listened to it in my car when I was driving over, right? Like these different environments, and you get a very different experience. And I think that's one of the...
Can you start to describe the differences?
Yeah, so one of the obvious fundamental thing about the text is that you have the very clear inscription of all caps, James Joyce, right down the center of the page.
Which you can't really hear when you hear.
You hear repetitions of J's, you hear certain things that recur, but it becomes a rhythm, and that typographic feature is lost. You have numbers along the sides, outside edges of the page. These correspond to the Viking edition. And those are actually really fun to watch because they start to grow faster and faster as he gathers syllables. So he gave himself a rule, he can only use each syllable once. So in the beginning, it's 3, 4, and 5 are on one page. And then the next page, it's already 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The next page goes from 11 to 19. They start skipping numbers, right? 20, 21, and then it skips all the way to 27, right? So there's also a kind of temporality or a tempo that's built into it where toward the end you have huge leaps. And most of those leaps come because you just can't find very many J's. There's only 1,797 J's
And he can't use the
in
same
the text.
syllable.
I'm sorry, how do you know that?
I analyzed it. There's 1,797 J's.
When you say you analyzed it, is there an electronic text of Finnegans Wake?
Oh yeah, lots of them.
Okay, so you can count.
Yeah.
Oh, this is the total number of J's.
The total number of J's versus,
available.
so listen to this.
Wake.
So there's 1,797 J's, very small number, as opposed to E's, of which there are 118,527.
And yet they're mostly silent E's.
Mostly silent E's, but very
Silent
easy to
E's.
find. M's, there's 28,000, but all of them, they're orders of magnitude
28,000
more. M's.
M's.
70,000 S's, 83,000 A's. But
So the J is really dominating.
Why?
J
How
is-
many Y's? Not so
I didn't do the full
Oh,
Joyce.
yeah. Whys
So-
would not be so many. That's really interesting.
But you can
But
watch
this
the numbers
was
skip forward.
jokingly in the preface, Danny. He's saying, "Well, I had to get this to be shorter because they only wanted a 33-page, printing in triquarterly or whatever.
Right.
So I came up with, and the J's were very convenient. But that's a funny thing.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
didn't really mean that.
Oh, it's a radical. I think he did. It's all about compression. I think it's totally the art of compression. Anthony Burgess made a shorter Finnegans Wake, which is a critical addition, just to make it easier for the layman to read.
But he wouldn't use that. He was asked, will you use that?
Oh yeah.
Cage, and he said, no, that's sort of stealing. No,
Yeah.
that's faking.
Yeah.
He wouldn't use the short version.
Yeah.
But, also,
Exactly.
He wouldn't
yeah.
use the short version. He's asked that somewhere in some interview. Why didn't you use that shorter
Yeah.
version? And he said, no, I didn't want to.
Because it's doing the same thing. It's an editorial
you
intervention
set
into
yourself
Cage.
these tasks, and he always did that, and that's what's fun is solving problems and the discipline. There's a huge amount of discipline here. It's a very disciplined work. In other words, what's not said is as interesting as what's said in many ways.
I mean, another, and maybe you both can kind of talk more about this, but other aspects of the language that is Joyce's language, but that Cage is highlighting, are the Irish dialect
Yeah, more
references.
fine
A lot
ladies.
of that fine ladies, and Killamidad, or there'll be these Irish sounding, and then the other that is really very beautiful, I think, is what happens with alliteration. And alliteration is incredibly important. I mean, there are all kinds of wonderful examples, like, for
Everything.
example, 141,
Chips.
Villa pleach, volla pluck,
Villa
thick up
pleach,
for
villa pluck.
flesh Nelly. So you've got that FF going. And so I thought of that, and I thought, now I'm describing alliteration in this writing for the second time. Am I describing Cage's alliteration, or am I describing Joyce's alliteration? And does that matter? I mean, does it matter whose it is? But it's an interesting question, because you get into the whole author,
I think that
idea.
is largely Joyce's.
Yeah,
myself.
me too.
But
Me
that's
too,
all
I would
right. I
agree.
mean, he's selected it in a certain way, and you have so many. I just came across the word prenunciation, like Nancy, prenunciation. Pronunciation. Now that would have been in Joyce, but the way he foregrounds, roll a pluck. What is it? I always notice that too. So the one with
park.
pluck.
Yes.
Where is it?
The park, the knockout in the park?
No,
At
pluck.
the top?
I
The
like
one
the
with-
knockout in the park.
I love that.
Is it the knockout in the park? Yeah, I mean, he has shortened it. One of his best messatic texts that I love is Writing Through Howl, through
Yeah.
Ginsberg's Howl. Have you ever heard
Yeah.
that, Al?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact,
Incredible.
we
And that's like
we
a
used
critique,
that.
and this is something we haven't talked about. When you said, what's the relation to Joyce? It's an homage, and it's also a critique. Always when you
Yes,
write
I was
through
trying to
somebody
get us
that
to
way.
the critique.
It
Can
is
we
a
go to the
critique in a-
critique?
Well, there is a critique in a way.
We know
that-
what we know what his critique of Howl is in Writing Through Howl.
Well, the grandiose, baroque,
Wordy.
I saw the best minds of my generation starving, hysterical, naked.
Right.
Saw,
Right.
like what's all the fuss about?
Right,
Yeah.
what's all the
Oh
fuss
yeah, well
about?
that is
Now-
really a critique.
So that's an easy. There's a messatic it's easy to understand the critique. This is a little harder. Can we
Yeah.
do it?
Well,
Yeah.
I think the critique is that there's a lot of narrative where it could be shorter, and he makes it much shorter, and you don't need all that. You just need the constellations in a way. They're like concrete portrait constellations, and you don't need all that narrative. There are places in the wake where, then it gets quite long, and then you're supposed to relate things philosophically and so forth. And of course, he doesn't do that, and the critique is the syntax. That it doesn't have
this critique
sentences.
is the syntax.
certainly a
That's the
critique.
key here,
And it's
right?
the difference between modernism and a later time. That Joyce is a modernist writer, and Cage wants to change that. And it has an overload of meaning. He would probably say it has such an overload of meaning when he said, I never read it, because he never wanted to read the whole thing. Of course he could have read it.
Danny, what I really like when I'm reading some kind of procedural, creative reading piece, aleatory piece, whatever, when a word appears as the result of the procedure that that becomes metapoetic and shouts out what the project is. Not a wing word, a word that had to be. My favorite in this passage is jerry building.
Jerry
Because
building.
this is what what he's doing here. He's kind of telling you this is Cage peeking through the Joyce, right? I don't know if there are other instances.
Oh,
of
there are
it.
many.
So that line though, just to push back on the critique, it's such a loving reading, and what I find so surprising
Can't
is
critique be loving?
yeah, of course it can, but what I find so interesting is that the wing words and the way that it's composed is really toward cohesion. Like it's not breaking the syntax; it's actually like reproducing.
So you're saying the procedure threatens to break it apart, but he restores cohesion.
Jerry building to the year, and laughed years, confusion hold them. I mean, so he's added the thes, the and the hold, which all connect. And so I think that like will to connect is unusual for Cage, and part of what makes this piece so interesting for me in the way he reads it.
Year, and laughed years. Laughed years, he talks about at great length in his conversation with Klaus Schoening about the oratorio. And he said, it's so wonderful, that's what all my work is. Laughed tears, the contrast.
There's another
the
example.
paradox of
Yeah.
laughed tears. And he said, don't forget, tears also has ears in it.
Yeah, oh,
But
that's
of course, that's a
beautiful.
wing
And
word.
he's got
Jerry
other words.
building
Yeah.
is a word he had to use. Laugh tears is a word he picked up.
Yeah.
He picked up. And but it rhymes with years. It's got the
It
same.
does.
It's
There's
an
a
I
rhyme.
rhyme with years. He's aware of that.
Yeah.
And so it really works. And he likes the after. And by the way, oratorio, when he said, it's in Joyce, I think it's on page 41. It is. You go back and look, and they're the oratorio. It took me a while to find it because the new Viking edition is 1 page different or 2 pages off, what he's saying. But there it is. There's that word, oratorios. So in a way, he's reading it. I think Danny's right. It's a new way of reading. And it's the way we read today.
It's absolutely the way
we
we
don't
read
tend
today.
to read
This is
novels
what you
and
meant
read
by
every-
anticipating the digital
We don't
culture,
read
right?
novels all the way through
And also the idea
and read every
of,
word
of
anymore.
intervention, that other events intervene.
That makes
and then
me-
you go back, and then maybe something intervenes again, and that's not a problem. You
He's
then
made
return.
that very clear.
This reminds me of a question that I, a few minutes ago, wanted to ask you. And this, I ask it of you thinking about writers, but also visual artists and musicians. What is to be gained? He's not about gain. What is to be derived? What advantage is to be derived from writing through someone else's work? What does writing through get you, as opposed to writing something that's "quote unquote" new?
Well, you have the constraint, which is the messatic, but what's interesting is this is not about chance operations or chance procedures. So the constraint
Nothing is left to chance.
Yeah, the constraint is really just the messatic, which, as Marjorie was saying, when it's James Joyce, is not as much of a constraint as it might be. But you're asking, what do you get when you actually write through
Why
it?
do we like this? Why do we do it? Why is this a procedure that works, as opposed to, well, I've read Finnegans Wake, or I've encountered Finnegans Wake, now I'm going to write my own work, I'm not going to use Finnegans. What's to be derived from writing through someone else?
Well, I think in part what's to be derived, at least from my experience, both reading and listening, and then trying to listen without reading, which is hard to do, is your imagination. This poem, this writing the second time through, does not give you time to let your imagination go somewhere.
You, meaning us.
Because he keeps going. So, for example, I love this line right here. It's on page 140. They were delivered, and you'll be a grandfer. Well, every time I see grandfer, I think of grandfather, so I've got to go back. No, grandfer. And then look at the next line. When the right hand seizes what the love arm knows, the left hand, the love arm. So these are phrases. These are turns of phrases taken from Finnegans Wake that play with language in such a way that you want to go back and actually right the wrong, actually say, oh, you really mean this. But if you do that, he's gone on. He's continuing to read. So there is, for me, this feeling of not tension, but kind of play between, am I really reading and listening, or am I letting my imagination complete the phrase? How does it work?
Thank you.
But
Marjorie.
you're asking the question, why not just write your own work? I mean, why do we want? Why
It's
is
a
it so?
basic question.
Basic question. And of course, many people hate this kind of thing.
Yes,
Think
I
we're
know.
ridiculous, not doing anything, you're just plagiarizing, blah, 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 etc. But it's the notion that when there is such wonderful language available, you can make something quite new by just using it and deforming it and showing other things and using it But of course, it does mean you believe in the how rather than the what more, that you believe that poetry. Now, Cage said that as early as Silence, in the preface to Silence. I always thought of poetry as a form. What is the sentence? It's right in the preface to Silence. As a form, a formal thing. Poetry is formalized language. That's how Cage defined it back in '62 when he was starting, the first thing he wrote. It's a way of formalizing the language. And he would have had no interest in the idea of poetry as saying something important or saying something interesting or, making a new statement about something, which is so common today and is always common. And so he's really basically fighting that, just as he fought in music against having a melody, it's the same fight.
But even as he fights against it, there are decipherable
Exactly.
words or audible
It has meaning.
words.
It does end up having meaning because you pause on certain things and you do think about also if you just create other meanings. But that goes back to the idea that there is no silence, that in silence you're just listening to other sounds. And this too makes you very sensitive. So what is the theme? If you want a theme here, if somebody wanted a theme, the theme is certainly not something about Finnegans Wake or the Irish or whatever. It is what can be done, with this particular discipline, how you can sensitize people to the play of sound, to the play of language, how they intersect, but how they're not the same, and how complex an artwork is.
And non-semantic, but
Yeah.
yet
Right.
semantic.
It doesn't have to say something.
And to
That's
present
what it
alternate
says.
modes of reading and to present those alternate modes of reading, I use the word deformed, which is I was thinking about Jerome McGann and Lisa Samuel's notion of deformance, where the idea is that by breaking down a work of poetry, they think about Dickinson, where to read a poem backwards would be a way to understand something you couldn't understand otherwise,
Right,
unless you
right.
read it backward. And I think that this is a singular, it's a singular way of reading Finnegans Wake, of deforming Finnegans Wake to produce its own singular kind of knowledge.
I have a sense of intimacy.
Of intimacy?
Cage wanted to engage with this text that he felt a little guilty he hadn't engaged with. He found a way to do it. He did it once, and the editor, didn't want it, so he did it twice. The idea of a second time through. Now he's gone through the whole work closely. There's really no way to read a text closer than to be looking for the J's, right? That's a close reading of a weird kind. But the intimacy, he's expressing his relationship to this text and finding a way to be intimate with it. And you might not get it from any kind of semantic sense of what the words are doing, but you'll get it from the fact of knowing the procedure. The procedure was he went closely through this book that he had owned for years and hadn't had a relationship to.
And it makes a difference. I wondered in the oratorio where he sent people out to get the sounds at the actual site. So he uses the Mink Gazetteer and he catalogs all the place names that are used in Finnegans Wake, millions of them. Many of them in Ireland, but they could be in Argentina. And he sends people to that place to collect a sound there. Now, at one level, that's completely ridiculous. You go to Argentina and you listen to a cow mooing in some village. Does a cow moo differently in Argentina than in Dublin, outside Dublin, or a horse urinating, or these sounds, a baby crying? Does a baby cry differently? But the effect is, when he says it's an Irish circus, honestly, when you hear the whole thing, it does sound like an Irish circus. It certainly doesn't sound like a Spanish circus or something. It has a quality that he somehow managed to get all those sounds, put them together, and you do get what he wanted.
Yeah.
And of course it's game in a way, but it's very serious play. And by the way, where is the first writing the first time through Finnegans Wake? I don't even know where it is.
We don't have it.
We don't have it.
Maybe it's in some
You
archive
see?
somewhere.
That's the great joke.
I
Where
have
is
a-
the first?
I have
He got rid of it, I think.
I have an idea about first time, second time that I want to share with you and get your reaction. But then I'd like us to go around and offer final thoughts. Something that
Are we already on final thoughts?
We are. Well,
Could I just
we can
say-
do 2 rounds of final thoughts.
Could I just say one thing about
course.
performance, since we've been talking about performance, and I think that's something really to be teased out more, is what kind of a performance is this, and how does it change, or how is it different? But and this is true of all performances, that if Jean-Yves Thibaudet performs Messiaen, it's going to be different. But one just kind of basic thing I wanted to mention is that he's both defying the idea of the stanza and following it. And it's totally unpredictable. So as you're reading, you think, oh, he's going right across the stanza to the next. He's not pausing. See, he doesn't want this to be read as stanzas. And just when you conclude that, he does complete the stanza. So it has this is part of performance. That's why I'm emphasizing it. It has this kind of unpredictability that I think is extremely effective and keeps you interested and reading, listening, which is remarkable. It's a virtuosic piece, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, here's my maybe silly notion about first time, second time. Get your reaction, please. Anytime I hear on first encountering, a first reading of something, when you have a major poet or major writer, major artist encountering another one for the first time, and he kind of says this autobiographically, this is the first time, all I can think of is another major poet encountering Homer for the first time in a certain translation. And of course, so on first encountering. What I love about this, and you suggested it to me when you said, where's the first version? It's not around. The second, there's something funny about, and clever and very modern about saying, I'm not going to play that Keatsian game of celebrating the first encounter. I think a second encounter is probably a better one, you know? Any thoughts about that? Is that in the background of this title?
But there's also a third, fourth, and fifth.
Inevitably, right? Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think it's what I call a differential text that Cage is already doing, in that way he's very up to date, that there isn't one set text.
Yeah.
And even this is not a set text. There could be another one, and they could be different, and then somebody else will read it differently. And so it also gives us the notion of a poem, that a poem is not that fixed thing that is etched in stone, whether you read it in an anthology or not. And you wouldn't read this in an anthology. How would you anthologize it?
Yeah.
So that's already another doctrine here. Instead of it being anthologized, it's a text, it's a process. You could do it again, but it is funny, the first one isn't there, and we only use the second. And the second becomes, in the oratorio, he uses the second.
Yeah.
And it occurs to me, by the way, when you were saying, could someone else read it? Laurie Anderson could read this and would read it very well. It would be a little different, but I can picture it. You know,
That's who I was thinking
the
of.
would be very, so it will be other people.
She was probably at the Nova thing. She probably heard him do this.
Probably. And I'm thinking about performance too. There's the performance of the poem of Cage reading it, but like each time you wrote through Finnegans Wake was a performance, right? It's a kind of improvisational. As you go, he chooses the wing words, he finds the next letter, he chooses the wing words there, and he lays it all out. And in a lot of ways, this one just works. Like some performances they work, and other ones don't, and you keep try again. Yeah.
But that's a really key word, improvisation, because Cage didn't really believe in improvisation.
No, right.
And how would you apply, would you apply the word improvisation to this?
I would. So as you're going through the book, you find the J, and then you're like, okay, there's a the and an in and a back by this J. Am I going to use, like, it's discrete moments of decision. So a very long form improvisation with a set score. Like the score is the messatics and but each moment of messastic, each time he finds one of those letters, he has an improvisational creative decision to make, and then he places that segment.
He's using the word improvisation in a slightly different sense.
In a very different sense.
That it's
Yes,
an
no, I
instantaneous.
understand.
I think that's true. That it's a process.
Yeah.
It's a process kind of form.
So too, the flat,
Responsive.
sly humor of saying that I did it once and it didn't work out, so I did it twice, suggests a view that's anti-revelatory. I don't want to buy into that ideology of the first encounter producing some kind of great thinking. I'm going to systematically do it again, and that's going to create the intimacy that I was describing before. We'll go around twice for final thoughts. I know you have so many final thoughts, so let's go around twice. Final thoughts. It doesn't have to relate to anything we've said. In fact, it would be even better if it was a new thought.
Well, this
Nancy, you're first.
will relate, and I'm actually going to quote from Radical Artifice. From Marjorie's Radical
from your
Artifice.
mother's
I
own
am,
book.
because there's a fantastic quote. This is actually, and it's very apropos, but it adds something to our discussion, definitely.
Radical Artifice is where the Writing Through How a section of one of your essays appears. No, that's a
The
different
section that I've selected, I'll just read, it's not that long, is part of the analysis of Lecture on the Weather. So it's specifically about Cage. Okay, Radical Artifice. quote, characterized by its opposition not only to, quote, the language really spoken by men, end quote, but also to what is loosely called formalist, whether new or old verse, with its elaborate poetic diction and self-conscious return to established forms and genres. Artifice in this sense, and this is in terms of lecture on the weather, but I think it applies also to the writing for the second time, artifice in this sense is less a matter of ingenuity and manner, of elaboration and elegant subterfuge, than of the recognition that a poem or painting or performance text is a made thing, contrived, constructed, chosen, and that its reading is also a construction on the part of its audience. So
Well
that
said.
absolutely
So
applies.
your final thought turns out to be hers.
I don't know that it's my fault.
I thought this enough.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank
very
you.
apropos.
And my final thought, and I never know whether one can convert people. You know, we put a little cage when we did the Library of America anthology of modernist poetry. We actually dared put in a few pages of Cage, and I don't even remember what it was. It wasn't from this, but it was a short thing. And Helen Wendler, when she reviewed the anthology, I mean, there are only 300 poets in it or whatever, you know, everybody from 1900 through whatever, everybody. She said, and it really, one of the great faults was that we dared include John Cage because he's obviously not a poet. Now, I run into that all the time. I've run into it when I lecture. You run into it, you know, you're going to keep running into it, but it is really silly because he's really not only a poet, but I think a really important, I'm so glad you decided to have a poem talk on him. He's a really important poet because, as Danny pointed out, I mean, he does each thing. He really is watching very carefully what he does, and they're very much constructed. They're by no means just following the rules. There's a big difference, I would say, and I'll get my head handed to it, but I'll say it, between him and Jackson McClough. You know, I'm not a great Jackson McClough fan, and I once said to Cage, I just don't get Jackson McClough. And he said, forget about the quality and just think of the quantity. That's what he said about Jackson McClough.
You're really dishing there.
Well, it became a great thing because when you think about it, well, there is something about having all that quantity. He didn't mean it totally negatively, you know, in that sense. But the point is, if you stop and compare some of Jackson McClough's writing throughs, or Cage, you'll see how good Cage really is. He doesn't quite get the credit for it because Jackson McClough does follow rules more closely, and you don't get the tension. You get this villa pluck. You get this incredible tension where you feel he has picked those wing words or lack of wing words. So Roth with 2-1, Nath and Joe. It could have just begun Joe. Joe
Right.
gives you the J.
Right.
Joe. So I think we have to find more ways of even showing, you know, to students and so forth, what an important poet Cage was, because there's still, the general public still, don't forget when he gave the Harvard lectures, which are also based on Messastic, the what do you call it lectures? What are they? The Norton lectures at Harvard. Half the audience walked out.
They certainly
And,
did.
and said, what is this? I mean, come on. And Cage always said he could go to the University of Kansas or any little college and do just fine. I really appreciate that. That's so true. And the places where they were worst about it was at Harvard, and the places where, oh, you know, what is this? And that's still true today. So, you know, nothing has changed very much. This is 1978. But one thing that makes me sad in a way is that as far as the university goes, things haven't, it isn't that now he's really recognized and so on. I should say, though, for the larger public and the musical public, he is played now, he is performed, he is recognized as a major figure. But as far as teaching him in university courses or anything like that, it's still on the whole, right? You think so? You think people do it? Maybe you do it, yeah.
And I
but
do it.
that's a great exception.
So,
do you do it in a course?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In ModPo, for instance.
Okay.
Yeah, Cage is in
Well, that's
ModPo. Writing through
wonderful.
Howl.
What?
Writing through Howl is in ModPo.
That's wonderful, but I think on the whole, it's still sort of, which is why Cage scholarship is very iffy in many ways, you know, because nobody knows quite what to do with it because it belongs to music, but quite because in general, it is still regarded as a sort of oddity, right? And that, you know, I remember when he gave one of his very best lectures at Irvine, and there was somebody sitting behind me who's an economist, I know, and who said, patted me on the shoulder. There was, what's his name from Penn? He had been at Penn originally. And he said, your guy Cage is just a, what did he say? I think he's something like a fraud, but it was a Jewish, what's the word? I can't even think.
Charlatan.
Yeah, he's just it's just crap. And that dies hard. And it would be a good question, why does Ashbery never get that criticism? They're contemporaries and kind of friends, and I think there are things where Ashbery's similar, namely Ashbery has the same theory of reading, which is you never read a book all the way through, you look out the window, you go to the movies, you come back, you read another line, who reads things consecutively, and his aesthetic wasn't so different, but Ashbery never gets that flack. Why is that?
Danny, you can, for your final thought, take that up or offer your own final thought.
I don't know the answer.
I don't know the answer to that. I had a series of final thoughts.
Okay.
Go ahead, let's hear them.
First, to do wrap up some of what we were saying around like why this version, I think it also has something to do with exactly what you're saying about Cage the poet making these creative decisions. In later versions of writing through Finnegans Wake, he would use a computer, and that computational process was much more like Mac Lowe. Some of his first encounters with the computer were for writing through this text. And those, I think, are much less successful. And I think it really is about finding a hyper procedural format that allows for
really
creative
important.
engagement. And I think that's a really that's something I've been very interested in terms of editorial poetics and thinking about editing. But the final part I really wanted to land on was something that you can't hear on this podcast, that you don't hear in the recording, but is so central to the work, which is the punctuation surrounding this text. We haven't had a chance to say a word about it. And it's silent both in the performance and it's silent in the way Cage reads it. He doesn't look or speak about or take cue from any of the punctuation.
But it's there.
Hopefully the pages might be distributed alongside the PoemTalk, but whenever there's something other than a period, like an exclamation point or a parentheses or a question mark, they're tilted and placed on the page according to chance operations. But the thing I really wanted to point to is that this was done with Alison Knowles as a kind of silent collaborator with this in this poem. Yes. So they were done in Vermont. While Cage, in between mushroom hunts, he and Alison Knowles, and I'm not sure what the proportion of work and labor was there, laid out the punctuation that really sets the visual element of the page upside down. So as a kind of invisible collaborator and an unheard one, I wanted my final note to be recognition of Alison Knowles' work in this piece.
Excellent, and if I can just
That's really
support
interesting.
what you're saying, it's almost serendipitous, because I was just looking at the text again and thinking, would I call this visual? Is this visually interesting? Does it make me want to turn the pages and look at different visual configurations? And I wouldn't say it does, but the presence of the punctuation, that subtle presence of the punctuation, suddenly brings that out. And after all, Cage was very visual and did visual work. So thank you for bringing in the Alison Knowles. That's really important.
Well, my final thought is just to mention my favorite part of the preface, which is when he's telling the history of his relationship to the text, to Finnegans Wake. He recalls very precisely in 1942, which is a few years after he bought his copy in 1939, Janet Fairbanks asked him for a song, and he looked in the book, browsed it, this copy he'd had since 39 but hadn't done anything with, and he found a passage on page 556. And then in our recording and in the preface, he reads it. And it is so beautiful.
Isn't it?
That reading is beautiful. And, I'll just read a couple of phrases from it, but it's just, and he reads it so lovingly, Cage does in this performance. Night by silent sailing night, Isabel, wildwood's eyes, primrose hair quietly, all the woods so wild, in mauves of moss and daphne dews. I love the daphne dews. How all so still she lay, 'neath of the white thorn, child of tree, like some lost happy leaf, like blowing flower stilled. He
And
really
it's so formal and it's so
so
elaborate.
formal, so
traditional in a
old-fashioned.
way. Exactly.
Yeah.
So lyric. And he's
So
really,
lyric and fun.
really
That's
sort of
very
giving us a kind of intellectual history of engagement with this. It's almost like there's Cage in 39, buying the book he knows to in a department store in Seattle, and in 42 he picks a song, and then he's really giving us a kind of personal history of the relationship. Well, we like to end PoemTalk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, a chance for several of us or all of us, if you're quick, to spread wide our narrow hands to gather a little something really poetically good to hail or commend someone or something going on in the poetry world or the art world. Who wants to start? Danny, you have a thought?
Sure. So many, and this conversation has been wonderful. I would like to point, I've been obsessed with the transmedia storytelling phenomenon that is Lil Michaela. This is an Instagram profile and celebrity. She has, I think, 2 million followers, was on Instagram for a long time and came out sometime last year as being a robot. She's clearly a CGI character. And there's a creative team in Los Angeles here, Brood.
Tell us the name again.
What's her name?
Lil Michaela, Lil Michaela. Very easy to Google. You'll find all kinds of articles. But really, it's presented as a celebrity in these articles, but I think it's the great storytelling project of the year.
2 million followers.
They've crafted the persona of Lil Michaela, her brother, who's named Rob Blocko, and this Trump-supporting enemy, whose name is Bermuda is Bay, and they have various scuffles. But Lil Michaela has been discovering herself. She realizes that she's not a human, that she's a CGI character, and she's trying to understand what her identity is. Her age is just an option on a computer screen. Her race, her gender, all these things were decided for her. And so she's trying to understand what she is on Instagram, and it's a beautiful commentary on living in networked environments, and it's all written by this creative team in LA.
Interesting.
Remarkable. Thank you. Nancy, Gather Some Paradise.
Say again. I'm sorry.
Gather Some Paradise, your recommendation.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just thinking of a couple. You mentioned Fluxus. We didn't really talk about Fluxus. It's important to say that Cage was not very interested in Fluxus and certainly didn't like to be considered the father of Fluxus, even though his influence was absolutely crucial. So I won't focus too much on the Fluxus Festival with the LA Philharmonic and the Getty Research Institute because that's finite. But I will just mention 2 pieces. One by and just let's think of those in relation to Cage, because I think Cage always comes out on top, no matter how effective the Fluxus piece. So Ken Friedman, Sonata for Melons and Gravity. Okay, it's very clever.
Yeah.
Sonata for Melons and Gravity, 1964, something like that, which involves 2, in the particular case of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, 2 people on the 2nd level of Disney Hall throwing a watermelon down so that it lands in a bin that has a sounding board, and you have this amazing sound. None of this could ever have happened without Cage. I mean, the whole idea of sound, of silence, of producers of sound. So I just want to mention, as part of our discussion, which has been so enjoyable to me, that Cage's presence is in so many places. Even where his name might not be uttered, we know that a piece like Sonata for Melons and Gravity, also the chance aspect, the open form, but where are the constraints? Are there constraints similar to those that Cage used? And if not, is that a problem? How do we evaluate the Fluxus pieces? All those questions fascinate me, even as I always think of them in relation to Cage.
Thank you so much.
That's what I would say.
Marjorie,
I'll
Gather
give
Some
a plug.
Paradise.
It just came in the mail 2 days ago. If you want to hand it to me,
This
the
one?
red
Oh.
book. Yeah, I'll give a plug to Kenneth Goldsmith's
Oh,
note.
you mean this one?
Next to it.
Maybe you can hold open a page so
Hold
that
open a page.
Zach can get a...
I declare a permanent state of happiness.
Okay.
That relates to the world of the happy is a happy world. In Wittgenstein, Kenny's writing through, if you've seen the Wittgenstein, Tractatus. I was very apprehensive about this when I heard about it because I thought, it's not so easy to write through the Tractatus, and how much does Kenny really know? You have on the left the actual text, the complete text of the Tractatus.
Hold it up and hold it still so we can get a good view of it? What's he doing there? Keep holding it and tell us what he's doing.
Well, I don't know, I just opened it random. But what he's doing is he takes almost every aphorism and relates it to some aphorism by later artists, whether conceptual artists, whether, whatever. So and they're drawings, sort of wonderful drawings. This is more of an artist book, and just the look of the pages themselves is very striking, and no two that are quite the same. And all the commentary possible. I think this is one of the best books he's done, better than certain recent ones that didn't work this way. And he really got into it, and he did read the Tractatus very carefully. And then it's like a riff on it with a lot of thoughts and a lot of similarities and also differences. And when you get, a comic version of it, and I think that is I originally know Kenny Goldsmith through there's Cage. Here's Cage right here. I originally know Kenny Goldsmith through Cage, because when he first wrote 73 poems, his first book, I think, that's all based on Joan LaBarbera songs, and it's all based on Cage, and Cage was really his kind of idol. Warhol is the other, and I have very little interest in Warhol, so that is not the thing. But the Cage, which he then became almost critical of because he said it's too utopian,
right,
maybe too positive.
Too severe also.
Yeah, he's critical of it, but the fact is he learned, most of the things he learned from, again, as Nancy said, this could not have been written without, I don't think this could have been written without Cage in some way, even though it's very different. So that,
wonderful.
I'll give that my
Well, My
plug.
Gathering Paradise is the experience of reading as much as you can of the thousands of poems that were typewritten by mostly one finger by Larry Eigner. There's a 4-volume, I think it's collected,
It is.
of Eigner. They use non-proportional spaced Times Roman, I think. No. What's the non-proportional space? The traditional typewriter font. Courier, right? And they use Courier non-proportional, so it looks a little like Eigner having typed it. Thousands of them, and you think, for me, Eigner. There are a lot of Eigner fans. I hope they're not going to get mad at me. For me, Eigner is not about any one gem that you find. It's about the experience of just reading the daily observations, one after another. And so somewhere in like volume 4, thousands of pages in, I found this poem. I just thought I would read it. It's purely observational, but it's also political, because what he does is presumably from his room in San Francisco, he's looking, and he sees someone has done either graffiti or someone posted something to maybe a telephone pole or a stop sign. It says "Stop War" on a stop sign. And that's as close as it gets to politics. This is 86, so we're talking about the Reagan era interventions probably in El Salvador and otherwise. So here it is. And just words: corner, stop sign, stop war, all caps, organization of the cars, arrowy traffic on the bigger road, no clouds cross the sky, space, buildings, windows. To me, that is, he's just observing. Organization of the cars is a wonderful pun. Organization, as in, you got stop war, so you think, oh, organization. But it's just the arrangement of the cars. It's a sort of, stop war is deceptively political. It's not really. It's a poem about somehow pecking out some words as what you see, Larry Eigner. It's called Corner Stop Sign, and you can find it on page, I don't know the page, but May 1986. Well, that's all the demilitarized syntax we have time for on PoemTalk today.
It was really interesting.
PoemTalk at the Writers' House, a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing and the Kelly Writers' House at the University of Pennsylvania and the Poetry Foundation, poetryfoundation.org. Thanks so much to my guests, Nancy Perloff, Danny Snelson, and Marjorie Perloff, and to PoemTalk's directors and engineers today, Zach Cardner and Chris Martin, and to PoemTalk's editor, the same amazing Zach Cardner, pointing at you, and once again, Zach, Chris, and Anna for coming out here to the left coast. And again, most sincere thanks to Marjorie for hosting us, and a shout out to Nathan and Elizabeth Light for their very generous support of PoemTalk. In our next episode, we'll be back in Philadelphia talking about Nasser Hussein's book of poems, written entirely of words made from 3-letter airport codes. skywritings. You have no idea how many words you can make from airport codes. Did you know there's an airport whose code is USA and it's not in the USA? And we'll be joined for that by Russianist Kevin Platt, the Nepali performance poet Ujwala Mahajan, and Nasser Hussain himself traveling to us from Leeds via Toronto. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us again for that or another episode of PoemTalk.
Awesome, thank you.
I didn't hear the helicopter.